In the late 1950s and early 1960s, steam was enjoying its Indian summer as the much-loved Stephenson locomotive gave way throughout the world to the alien diesel and electric locomotives. In Great Britain, interest in railways was on the increase, and the then novel BBC television was persuaded that there was an audience for pure railway films, and so Railway Roundabout was born. For 5 years, from 1958 to 1962, Patrick Whitehouse and John Adams filmed, edited and produced films about all aspects of railways, presenting 10 25-minute shows a year at 5:30 in the afternoon, ostensibly for children, but in time for many adults to tune in. The films themselves were carefully retained and are now part of our national heritage, being held in the care of the National Railway Museum at York. The programmes which form this series of 5 have been prepared from those original films, so we can all once again relive the great days of the Railway Roundabout. The first Railway Roundabout programme of all appeared on BBC television on the 20th of April 1958. It featured a film recording the closure of a railway, an event that was to become all too familiar in the years to come. The railway which closed at the beginning of 1958 was the former London and North Western Railway and later LMS and Western Region route, which served the South Wales coalfields. This was known as the Heads of the Valleys line, as it ran along the north side of the range of mountains which contained the coal, on which the prosperity of the region had been built. It ran from Abergavenny, where we see the train being prepared. In Victorian days, the height of private enterprise and business competition, the North-Western had provided the competition to the various private South Wales railways and the Great Western, which dominated the coastal end of the valleys. This competition resulted in some valleys and coal mines being serviced by 3 or more different railway companies, and of course, competitive pricing at a time when coal was the principal fuel for British industry. Nationalisation of the railways in 1948 eliminated the competitive element, and the new organisation set about the nationalisation of its system, closing duplicate routes throughout the country. This went hand in hand with the scrapping of many historic locomotive types, and Pat Whitehouse and John Adams were only just in time to record many of these for posterity. The final train on the Heads of the Valleys line was hauled by the last remaining example of Francis Webb's London and North Western Railway coal tank class, and one of his Super D 080 heavy freight engines. The train had been organised by the Stephenson Locomotive Society's Midlands area branch, which was very active in the 1950s and 60s, ensuring that many branch lines and cross-country lines, such as this, were visited by special trains. It was a time when railways were still the main form of transport for many, but also when enthusiasm for railways was growing, evidenced by the popularity of the Railway Roundabout programmes themselves. The train commemorated not only the closure of the main line, but a number of branches as well. The engines ran down the short branch to Ebbw Vale and returned by pushing the train back to the junction at Beaufort. The coal pits were to remain served by the Western region. The naming of express trains is a tradition going back to the earliest days of the railways. In the 1950s, the Western region's principal expresses were the Cornish Riviera Express, serving the West Country, and the Bristolian, serving the Great Western Railway's raison d'etre, Bristol. In 1958, the railway roundabout cameras went to Bristol's Bath Road locomotive depot to see the train being prepared. 10 years after nationalisation, Great Western traditions were still paramount, with train reporting numbers on the smoke box door, the coats of arms of the cities served, London and Bristol, on the headboard, and Castle-class 460s powering the train. The driver's name on the cab side was an innovation in 1958, but was only in use for a short time during that year. This film served to show just how much preparation was needed for a top-link express locomotive in the days of steam. It was the driver's responsibility to ensure that all oil reservoirs were filled, known as oiling round. This also involved going under the locomotive to deal with inside valve gear and cylinders. As befits a prestige train, the engine was one of the latest of its type, a Castle-class built after the war. It sported a flat-sided tender of the Hawksworth pattern, which was filled with water before moving off to collect its train. This engine, number 7018, the Swilling Castle, was one of the first two to be fitted with a double chimney and exhaust and allocated to the Bristolian. Preparation of the train also involved the guard. At the carriage sidings, we see the guard bring the tail lamp to the back of the train. His next job is to record the carriage numbers and to do the weights, noting the weight of each coach and the makeup of the train. Meanwhile, the yard carriage examiner ensures that the accumulators are full, brakes are working, and so on. Inside the train, the restaurant car staff prepares tables for afternoon tea as the train ran after lunch. The guard affixes seat reservations to the seat backs, most stock being of the compartment type. With the engine coupled on, the guard gives the driver the weights. For example, 10 for 350 means 10 coaches weighing 350 tons. The train ran into Bristol Temple Meads station from the southwestern end. The coaches were mostly the most recent British Railways standard type, but painted in the Great Western livery of chocolate and cream, used from 1957 on the Western region's named expresses only. Headlamps over each buffer indicate an express passenger train. An 82A on the small oval plate on the smoke box, a Bristol Bath Road locomotive. The fire is built up to the firebox door in true Great Western fashion, and the train is ready for a prompt departure. A special camera mounting was used for shots of the locomotive at work from the cab. This was clamped to the cab side sheets. Inside the train, afternoon tea is served. The dining car was an original Great Western vehicle in this train, and uniformed attendants still gave silver service. The train ran via Filton on the Badmington route through Swindon and Reading to London. It was the only train booked to run at 100 miles an hour in the 1950s, and as such, quite a celebrity. Inside the train, a first-class passenger could relax, whilst the guard, a man at the top of his profession and still sporting the full Great Western gold-braided uniform, checks tickets. In this instance, a young family with second-class tickets, third class was upgraded to second in the late 1950s, were found in a first-class compartment. At speed, there was considerable vibration on the footplate. Filming for this feature took place over 5 days. On the Friday, line-side shots were taken and resulted in this view of a king on the Bristolian. The Great Western's heaviest express engines were used on Fridays when the train weight was increased for the weekend. Inside, the guard makes up his log. All trains were recorded in this way, information on running being compiled from this data together with signalmen's logs in the age before computers. Finally, we run into Brunel's great masterpiece Paddington Station, housing pilot engines. From the platform, we see the other double-chimneyed castle, Earl of Mount Edgecombe, arriving with the Crack Express. A good job, well done. Later in the year, John Adams filmed a branch that was the antithesis of the Bristolian, the Cardigan branch in rural southwest Wales. This was a classic small Great Western terminus, with a single platform station served by a one-coach train, to which had been added a single box van. Note the various railway staff in their uniforms. Even a small station like this had a station master, porter, ticket office staff, signalmen, shunters, and so on. These handled a train service of 4 trains a day, taking 1 hour 40 minutes to travel 27.5 miles to the main line junction at Whitland. On this occasion, this required the use of 2 of the Great Western standard branch line locomotives, the class 4500 small prairies. Number 4550 is to take the train back along the branch line, while 4558 moves over to the goods yard to take water and to prepare to take the branch freight train out. The driver is given the train's staff token to allow him access onto the single line. The Cardigan branch still had 5 years to work when these films were taken, closing to passengers in September 1962. However, the original reason for many branch lines was freight traffic, the Cardigan branch starting life as a mineral railway. As can be seen by the length of this pickup goods train, freight was quite substantial until the road lorry, with its inherent flexibility, made heavy inroads. This had been taking place throughout the 1950s, and during the time that Railway Roundabout was on the air from 1958 to 1962, the drift became a flood, destroying the railway's economics. Freight traffic survived a mere 8 months after the passenger traffic had gone. Passenger trains were normally handled by the Great Western's last design of light passenger tank engines, the 1600 small panniers, number 1637 being the regular engine at this time. Note the single lamp under the chimney, denoting a local passenger train. The last wagon on the goods train is the guard's van, this being the characteristic Great Western style of van with a single veranda. A short distance along the North Pembrokeshire coast to the west of Cardigan lies Fishguard Harbour, the principal port for sailings to Southern Ireland. The ship arriving is the St. David, a 1950s replacement for the original ferry of that name, provided in 1906 when the Great Western Railway formally opened its new extension railway from Clarbeston Road to Fishguard Harbour. This was at the height of ocean-going travel, when transatlantic liner competition was at its most intense, and Irish emigration to the United States was at full flow. The new station and port at Fishguard replaced that of Nayland, initially serving the Irish route from the 30th of August 1906. Ships berthed alongside the station, from where boat trains ran to Paddington, and still do today. This is Knowsley Hall, waiting with the stock of the capital's United Express, a portion of which served Fishguard. From 1909, Fishguard became a regular port of call for the Cunard line, which served Liverpool. Liners such as the Lusitania and Mauretania made their first landfall at the harbour, and fast ocean liner expresses ran direct to London to try to make the fastest run from New York to London. By 1958, Fishguard was serving the Irish traffic with night services to Rosslare, daily in summer and every 2 days in winter, and daytime services to Cork and Waterford on alternate days. The Waterford service was to cease the following year. Once again, we see evidence of the railways losing traffic to the roads. The car ferry services had increased during the 1950s, although the days of drive-on, drive-off ferries were yet to come. This Jaguar Mark I is as much a symbol of the 1950s as the container wagon behind it, the first flowering of the railway's bid to cooperate with road transport, which was to develop into the freightliner concept of today. The railway was single-track for the first few miles from Fishguard and commenced with a stiff gradient, necessitating banking from the harbour station. It was then double-tracked throughout and maintained as a main line. Local traffic was not significant. Pat Whitehouse took the ferry to Ireland in order to film the activity on August Bank Holiday 1958 at the fair held in the small town of Ballinamore, which was also the principal town served by the Cavan and Leitrim Railway, one of Ireland's famous narrow-gauge network, which had been decimated in the 1950s. The C&L was the last survivor of this network, as its purpose was to transport coal from the mine at Arigna for use in Ireland's coal-fired power station. It was to survive another 2 years, closing in 1960. The mine at Arigna was at the end of the Drumshanbo branch, which left the main line at Ballinamore, where the railway's works were situated. It had acquired a number of engines from other Irish narrow-gauge lines, numbers 3 and 4 coming from the Tralee and Dingle. The engine on the left was an original C&L 440 tank. In the station, we see the Arigna branch train, a mixed, waiting for the coal train we saw earlier to arrive. This is headed by Tralee and Dingle number 6T, a Hunter 260 tank. This would reverse here to go on the C&L main line. The Tralee and Dingle had survived until 1953, cattle trains being its last function. These cattle are being loaded into the typical Irish cattle wagons, which had no roofs. Agricultural traffic had already been mainly lost to road transport, but here in Northwest Ireland, the railway still hung on to some of the business. The train was assembled alongside the goods shed with another Tralee locomotive, number 5T, ready to take it up the main line. This engine was a Hunter 262 tank. The T in the number was to indicate an ex-Tralee locomotive. The branch train is held to await a mainline one from Drummond, behind a former Cork, Blackrock and Passage 242 tank. Drummond was on the Sligo to Dublin main line, and the C&L formed a link between that line and the Great Northerns line to Belfast. Once again, the train is a mixed passenger and freight train. Rural Irish communities in the 1950s were very poor and still relied on rail transport, but not for much longer. Pat then went on to Stranraer, the headquarters of the County Donegal Railway. The railway had put on 2 bank holiday steam specials to Ballyshannon. Normally, passengers were carried in diesel rail cars. Here we see one of these being made up at Stranraer by one of the railway's 262 tanks. In this poor country, passengers would feel the loss of their train services. This railway wouldn't see the 1950s out, closing on the 31st of December 1959. The general manager, Barney Curran, never turned a passenger away. One of them was so drunk, Mr. Curran put him in the cab in front of the fire in order to sober him up. Trainers taking the left-hand route to Ballyshannon, straight ahead would take it to Glenties. The line ran over the mountains past Loch S to Donegal town, passing the halt at Loch S. This was the Barnesmore Gap, and the weather wasn't very kind. At Donegal town, the train had to reverse as the main line ran to Kilbegs, with the Ballyshannon line coming in from the east. The locomotive was serviced here before taking the train bunker first to its destination, where the passengers had a mile-long walk to the sea. Note the special saloon in the background at Ballyshannon. Back at Donegal town, we see a normal service train arriving, formed of 2 rail cars plus a steam coach. Normally 1 rail car would suffice, but this was a bank holiday. The rail cars had to be turned, complete with passengers, as they were single-ended vehicles. The driver's cab was a separate unit, mounted on the 4-coupled chassis, but articulated the passenger cabin. 2 of these machines survive today, having travelled halfway across the Irish Sea to the Isle of Man, where the splendid Victorian Isle of Man steam railway continues to find a use for them. With both rail cars now turned, an additional coach is added to the train, which sets off over the mountains alongside Donegal Bay. These rail cars were used very much like road buses, with steps down to ground level allowing them to stop anywhere, not just at conventional stations. But even they failed to save the day for the charming Irish narrow gauge. In the days before package holidays and sophisticated tastes for overseas travel, many people had their holidays in the United Kingdom, and the holiday paradise was the West Country, billed as the English Riviera by the Great Western Railway. To this end, the railway provided holiday accommodation of its own to supplement the hotels and boarding houses of Torbay, Newquay and St Ives. At a number of small wayside stations, redundant coaching stock was parked in sidings and connected up to local services, the resulting camping coaches providing very cheap holidays at a time when youth groups and schools were first arranging holiday programs. Many boys were loco spotters and, of course, were the target audience of the railway roundabout programs. A holiday in a railway carriage was thus something very special, complete with loco spotting. Gara Bridge was an intermediate station on the Kingsbridge line in South Devon, close to where Whitehouse was enjoying a 2-week holiday. He went to the little station on the Saturday to record these scenes of a time and innocence now gone forever. Although the delights of Paynton or Plymouth were easily reached by train, the revellers appear quite happy to besport themselves in the river or the fields beside the station. The coaches themselves were former main line corridor stock, which were brought to the line at the beginning of each season and returned to Swindon at the end of it for winter maintenance and overhaul. The signal on the right gave access to the camping coach siding. The Midland Railway's main line from Bristol to Birmingham is famous in railway circles for the severe gradient it encounters as it passes over the Lickey Hills, just south of the Midland city. The top of the climb is at Blackwell, where we join some loco spotters as they view two British Railway Standard Class 5 460s, the second coming up the bank with a Standard Class 9F at the back. The top of the climb is immediately to the south of the platforms, where a Stanier Class 5 shows the extent of its severity. On the back of this train is a Western Region Class 4200-280 tank, number 5226, which dates these sequences after May 1958. The Midland Main Line had been placed in the Western Region after nationalisation in 1948. The Lickey Bank starts at Bromsgrove Station, and from the platform can be seen the foot of the bank. Banking engines would come down the bank light engine, frequently in convoy, especially when the line was busy. They were stabled in sidings to the west of the line. Alongside the big 280 can be seen a Hawksworth pannier tank. These became the standard bankers under the Great Western regime, the 4200 only lasting a short while. Banking engines were classified on a special system, based on the power of an LMS Ginty tank, the forebears to the panniers. The 280 was equal 1.5, in other words, equivalent to 1.5 Ginties. The panniers were equal 1, and the BR9F equal 2, so the 1.5 tank didn't fit neatly into the system. The most famous Lickey banker was Big Bertha, a unique Midland Railway 010O, which had been scrapped and replaced in 1956 by a BR Standard Class 9F 210O. This engine inherited Big Bertha's powerful headlamp for buffering up at night. This train has =3 banking power. The old order is seen here as two of the Ginties are passed by an LMS Class 2P 440 on one of the infrequent local passenger trains calling at Bromsgrove. These varied the pattern by having the bankers buffering up in the platform, as all other trains stopped outside the station. Even a 4-coach train needed a banker, as the gradient was 1 in 37.7 for a distance of 2 miles. Another 2P climbs the bank with a gas wagon at the back. These wagons were used to deliver gas to railway stations before the national distribution system was installed. On the footplate of the banker, we see the procedure at the top of the bank as the train accelerates away from Argenti. Banking engines didn't couple up for obvious reasons. The signal box gave a panoramic view of trains coming over the summit, and Pat Whitehouse's family enjoyed the sights here, at a station only a few miles from their home in Birmingham. All the railway roundabout programs were produced at the BBC's Gloucester Green studio in Birmingham, after editing by Pat and John Adams. Both live nearby and still do, so they were able to go into the studio to provide the commentary, which was given live after one rehearsal. Any fluffs had to be covered up at the time. We remain at Blackwall inside the signal box to see the procedure for the control of trains on the Lickey incline. The up line from Bromsgrove was provided with an intermediate block signal to allow two trains to climb the bank at the same time. After Blackwall had accepted an up train from Bromsgrove, the train left under the gantry at the south end of the platform and was then under the control of the Blackwall signalman. As the train accelerates up the bank, the Bromsgrove starter returns to danger. In the box at Blackwall, the signalman pulls off to give the train a clear run through the section. The train is first shown as following train in section as it proceeds up the bank towards the intermediate block signal. The line was fully track-circuited, and the train's position was shown on the signalling diagram. As soon as the train has passed the intermediate block signal, it shows as leading train in section, and the signalman can return the signal to danger and accept a second train from Bromsgrove. It's interesting to note that both the locomotives seen here are Caprotti valve-geared versions of the familiar Stanier Black 5s. At Blackwall, the indicator shows that the signalman has accepted the second express, and as it runs onto his track circuits, it's shown as following train in section. All this is also displayed on the signalling diagram. The leading train comes past the box as the signalman looks out to ensure that the complete train with its bankers passes his box. When he's satisfied the complete train has passed him, he sets his home signal to danger, whilst the second train approaches the intermediate block on the bank. This can now be cleared to allow the train to continue its climb as far as the signal box. With the banker cleared out of the way, the road can be set for the second train to proceed without being held up, as the leading train will have accelerated away on the level beyond Blackwall, giving a clear run for the second train. The signal returns to danger. The bankers can reverse across to the down line to return to Bromsgrove, watched by the signalman. More than one banker at a time can be signalled in this way. The treatment of freight trains on the Lickey also merited special attention. This Midland 4F has just come out of the goods loop at Blackwall and is to proceed down the bank. Note the bankers on the down road. In steam days, most freights had at least some of the wagons loose coupled. This meant that the wagons didn't have brakes controlled by the locomotive, only hand brakes on the wagons themselves. However, in many instances, freight trains would have a fitted head. The wagons at the front of the train had been fitted with locomotive-controlled brakes. In order to prevent the train from running away down the bank and pushing the locomotive along, it was necessary to apply the brakes before descending. Handbrakes had to be applied by a shunter at the side of the track, using a special pole as the train passed. This practice would certainly fall foul of health and safety at work legislation today. If the train had a fitted head, only every third or fourth loose wagon had to have its brakes applied. If it was fully loose coupled, all wagons had to have their brakes on. The signal goes off again to allow the passage of an up freight. These would usually take their bankers on in the reception sidings on the upside at Bromsgrove. Finally, we see a pair of ginty bankers returning to their base. The family resemblance between the ginties and the Midland Railway Class 2F060 freight engines shows the direct linears that ran through Midland and early LMS design. One of these is seen at Halesowen, a joint station where a branch from the Midland Main Line 4 miles to the north of Blackwell ran to Halesowen to an end-on junction with the Great Western from Old Hill on the Stourbridge to Smethwick line. The locomotives were shedded at the Midland's Bourneville shed, and only these 2Fs and smaller 1Fs were allowed to work on the line due to weight restrictions imposed by the spindly Dowry Dell viaduct. Midland trains ran no further than Halesowen, but Great Western pannier tanks worked through to the Austin Works at Longbridge with non-advertised workmen's trains 5 days a week. This part of the line was jointly owned. Halesowen itself was at the foot of steep banks in either direction, and trains had to be banked. This is the cause of the weight restrictions, Dowry Dell viaduct. The line closed from Halesowen to the Austin Works at Longbridge as late as 1969, although the workmen's train ceased in 1958. The crossing gates were at Frankley, where the present M6 motorway services are situated. The only crossing point on the line was at Rubery, near which was situated an asylum. The joint section of the line was worked by electric train staff, while the Great Western part was operated by electric train token. 3 branch lines were featured in 1958, the second being the Southwell branch in rural Nottinghamshire. This ran from Royston Junction on the Nottingham to Lincoln line. The branch was well known in the late 1950s, as it was the last haunt of the classic Midland Railway Johnson 044 tanks, which worked the branch on the push-pull principle. The line had once been part of a through route via Mansfield to Sutton in Ashfield, but the section to the north of Southwell had closed as long ago as 1929, although freight continued to run as far as Blidworth via Southwell. Southwell Station was the first on the line, and there were therefore no intermediate stations on the run from Royston. It was an ornate through station in Midland style, although only one platform was needed. Both the branch and the locomotives were under the threat of extinction, the last of the tanks going in 1960 and the branch closing in 1959. So the railway roundabout team was just in time to show another fast disappearing facet of railway operation. An additional signal on the down platform allowed the train to depart from the arrival platform without crossing over. Back at the junction, the Johnson tank ran forward in order to cross over to the down platform. Note the Midland Railway signal to the left, the standard wooden-clad signal box in the background. The third branch was the Hayling Island line, another with weight restrictions due in this case to the wooden viaduct which crossed the head of Langston Harbour. This little branch was well known in the 1950s as it was dominated by the famous London, Brighton and South Coast Railway class A1X Terrier tanks, built to the designs of William Stroudley from 1872 to 1880. They provided power for both passenger and freight trains on the branch, although this was one of the few lines in the 1950s where mixed trains with both passenger and freight vehicles in the same train were still permitted. Note in the foreground the small wooden coal stage. The engines were stabled here during the week and worked the 4.5 miles run to Havant, the station on the Portsmouth to Guildford and Brighton routes. Many of this famous class lives on in preservation, but not this one. Number 32661 was one of those fitted with a spark arrestor on its chimney to work at New Haven Harbour earlier in its career. Rolling stock included both pre-grouping and British Railways coaches. These dwarfed the little engines, which were surprisingly powerful for all their diminutive size. In the summer, the line boasted a 15-minute frequency, but it was closed in 1963. Terriers also featured on a rail tour special in 1958 to the Kent and East Sussex Railway. Here we see the stock being prepared at Robertsbridge, the junction on the Tunbridge to Hastings main line. The leading engine is one of the class to survive today, as it remained in British Railways service until 1963. And is preserved here on the Kent and East Sussex Railway. It was built in 1880 as number 78 Knoll and had spent a part of its life on the Isle of Wight as number W4 Bembridge. This resulted in its extended bunker, a feature of the Isle of Wight engines. The second engine was the Brighton Works shunter, which was painted in the LBSCR's Stroudley Improved Engine Green and lettered with the works name. This engine has not survived. The train was organised by the Locomotive Club of Great Britain London branch and came down to Robertsbridge behind one of the Morsel rebuilds of Wainwright's class E440s of 1905, number 31019. For certain events, both Pat and John filmed, giving two views of the train arriving. Passengers then transferred to the branch train in time-honoured fashion. By this time, the Kent and East Sussex Railway was only used by freight trains as far as Tenterden, and by summer-only hop pickers specials. It was, of course, destined to be preserved, the railway of today recreating the appearance of the rural branch line. The train is seen here at Northiam, the westernmost point of the preserved railway in the early 1990s. Again, two cameras recorded the departure. Stock from all the main constituents of the Southern Railway was employed on the train, very much in the tradition of the Kent and East Sussex. Water was taken at Rolvenden, the headquarters of the railway in its independent days. It was one of the famous Colonel Stevens light railways, Colonel Holman F. Stevens having built up a small empire of impecunious railways throughout the United Kingdom, of which the KESR was the star, where he had his office. With the passengers milling about the yard, the train was drawn forward so that the second terrier could take water. This caused a traffic jam on the main A28 road, which was crossed on the level here. The train then climbed Tenterden Bank to the terminus of the line at Tenterden. The railway had previously run beyond here to the main Tonbridge to Ashford line at Headcorn. But this section had closed in 1954, the date when regular passenger services were withdrawn. Back at Robertsbridge, the main train was drawn back into the station by the E1. This train was to continue on down the main line to visit Bexhill West and Newhaven, before returning to London Victoria Station. Top and tail working with terriers was common practice on special trains on the Kent and East Sussex, the hop pickers trains also employing this arrangement. As the E1 departs, the narrow coaches can be seen. This was because of tight clearances through the tunnels on the Hastings line. Our final feature in 1958 takes us to the docks again. One of the largest and most famous docks railway systems in the country was that at Southampton, which was owned by the railways. Particularly well known were the Southern Region's USA class of dock shunting engines, which had been bought as government surplus after the war. 14 of these machines roamed the docks throughout the 1950s. There was a tremendous variety of locomotives to be seen on the dock system, which was still working at its peak. One of the Southern Region's Class 5 locomotives is seen bringing an ocean liner express into the docks, passing an ex-London Brighton and South Coast Railway E1060 tank, which is then seen at the watering point alongside a USA and another Brighton tank, a Class E2. Mainline engines were serviced at Eastleigh Depot, but the shunters had their own depot within the docks complex. Each locomotive's duties were denoted by a disc with a number on it fitted to the lampirons. Southampton Docks was very cosmopolitan. No doubt the sailors of this American merchant vessel would have felt very much at home when they saw the switches, or Class USA tanks. They'd been brought over to Europe as austerity machines and offered for sale as surplus to requirements after the war. Their very short wheelbase, easy maintenance and comparative power made them ideal dock shunters. This engine was unique, being built by Porters, whilst all the others were built by Vulcan. The USAs were supplemented by 4 of the Brighton-class E2 tanks, which had a much longer wheelbase at 16 feet than the Americans at 10 feet. 32109 had arrived in November 1956. reason for John Adams' visit to Southampton was to film the radio-telephone cab-to-shore system that was in use to control movements around the docks. This was unique in Great Britain. The locomotives were equipped with whip aerials, radio-telephones and turbo-generators to provide the required power. The drivers at first objected to their loss of freedom, but were mollified when they realized that they had an efficient form of communication back to base. This meant they could get relief crews or remind control when their shift was at an end. In addition to the transatlantic trade, the port of Southampton catered for much closer traffic. Channel Islands boats were met by Channel Islands boat trains, which were frequently headed by bullied light Pacifics. And it's number 34063 of the Battle of Britain class that we see partly in warehouse number 9. This engine bore the name 229 Squadron to commemorate the Battle of Britain heroes of the Second World War. Although registered at Liverpool, Cunard's flagship Queen Elizabeth was the most famous ship at Southampton in the 1950s. This magnificent liner, together with her sister ship Queen Mary, ran a weekly service from Southampton to New York, in competition with United States liners. So important was this traffic to the railways, even after the war, that a new ocean terminal had been built specifically to cater for the huge liners. This was considered to be a major project in its day, and it had 2 railway tracks feeding directly into it, so that passengers had as little hardship as possible when transferred from ship to train. Special trains were run, usually with headboards. Maunsell's Lord Nelsons monopolized this traffic, and his equally famous King Arthurs were also to be seen on this work. The Lord Nelsons were allocated to Eastleigh Depot principally for the boat train work, the named expresses being made up of Pullman stock in the case of the Cunarder and United States Lines trains. Also to be seen were trains for Union Castle and many other shipping lines, after which Bulleid's Merchant Navy class locomotives were named. "30074 was the last of the USA class, but 4 of them have been preserved. Not so lucky, though, was the docks complex. Today, this area has been turned over to a multi-screen cinema and housing. However, that was in the long-distant future. 1959 was just around the corner.